In this video, I'd like to take a look at a group-based prioritization technique we sometimes call funneling. The specific learning objectives will be to first provide a broad overview of this facilitation technique and then compare it to other prioritization tools. And then we'll look at some specific funneling prioritization examples where we take a large stakeholder list and funnel it to come up with the vital few most important stakeholders, and take a look at a large list of critical to quality variables and prioritize it using funneling to come up with the vital few that we might then go out and measure. All right, I've cleaned up my screen a little bit, and I just thought I'd lay out how the funneling approach works. And in this example, I've got a large list that I want to have prioritized. The goal is to get to a final smaller list. In this example, I'm using stakeholders, so we want to get it to the vital few most important stakeholders. And one technique would be to bring the team in the room with the list of stakeholders and go through a voting exercise to get from the many down to the few. And in a funneling approach, it'll be multiple rounds of voting to get to that final smaller numbered list where we don't have 23 in this example to begin with. We end up with, well, some of the research on voice of customer interviews suggests that you should have no more than 10 stakeholder groups that you have in your final list. So how do we go about doing that? Starting with the large, vetting it down to the few using the funneling approach. Let's look at that. But before we do, I just want to make sure that folks realize that this isn't the only way to start with a large list and come down to a much smaller list. There are other prioritization techniques. So one of the reasons why I like the funneling approach best when it comes to prioritization is it is a quick and effective way to get from many down to the few, and it utilizes the insight and experience of all of your team members. But it's not the only way to do prioritization, and in some cases, it's not the best way. So I just wanted to share with you a list of other techniques that could be used. We won't cover them in this video. We'll save that for other video topics. And some of these are pretty advanced and only used in rare occasions. But that said, it's nice to know that there are other techniques. At a simple level, we've got pairwise comparison, where for each of the items that we are trying to vet to come up with the few, we take each item and compare it to the other. It can be very time consuming, especially if you've got large group environments. An additional step to pairwise comparison is to then force rank the results where you place weighting values, and inside the business process improvement workbook, we've got an example of a force weighting technique where we use play money to come up with our values. Pew matrices are another technique that can be used to prioritize results where we have a standard or a good or a best in class product or feature, and then we compare each of the elements in our list to that standard and come up with our final best set. One of the most popular techniques other than funneling are scoring matrices. And we'll look at an example of building a scoring matrix a little bit later in the video series where we come up with scoring, where we come up with a spreadsheet-based way of scoring solutions. Very popular approach though, scoring matrices using spreadsheets. Speaking of spreadsheets, though, there's an entire set of spreadsheet techniques that can be used to prioritize and come up with a final best list. Some of those include quality function deployment and the artifact that's created called a house of quality spreadsheet, sometimes referred to as an HOQ. Analytical hierarchy process, which is a derivation of the QFD approach. and conjoint analysis and design of experiments, kind of at the deepest theoretical level, for all techniques to take large lists and prioritize down to the vital few. We'll focus, though, on one of the quickest and most effective, funneling. Let's look at using it next. All right, now what I'd like to do is go through a funneling exercise in a step-by-step approach. We'll go through it first using stakeholder lists, and then we'll create a separate example with critical to quality variables. Two very common large list activities that we then need to vet into a much smaller final list for either voice of customer interviews in the case of stakeholders, and in the case of CTQs, we want to have a much smaller final vetted list for our data collection plan in the measure phase. So let's start with the step-by-step approach. Number one, we work on creating the large list. And we've got earlier videos on how to do that for stakeholders, how to do that for CTQs. But I've got a big list, 23, and in my final vetted list, I want to get to 10 or less is a common threshold for voice of customer interview. After the big list is created, we display that to the group, and in step 2, we identify the group-based voting rules. Typically, I'll give each team member a red pen or red voting dots, some sort of tool for them to place their votes on the stakeholders that they feel are most important to make it to the final list. I'll use red checks. In some facilitation textbooks, the rules for voting are further refined. Not only are you going to place red check marks next to the stakeholders that are most important in your own personal view as a team member, but we also restrict by the number of votes that you're given. Maybe you only get 3 voting checks or 3 voting dots. I don't restrict. I instead say to my team members, based upon your knowledge of the process, our understanding of the process map, what we are trying to perform in future state as described in our goal statement. I want you to identify or vote on stakeholders that you feel are the most important to make it to the final list. So pretty simple voting rules. After we have established the voting rules, how many checks you get, and the goal of trying to get to our final vetted values, you create your group filter funnel. This is going to be an attribute that is important for the final list of whatever you're looking at to have. And in the case of stakeholders, my typical first filter funnel is their insight on understanding current state performance or insight on what is needed in future state. And by insight, I mean this stakeholder is going to provide us with more knowledge than any of the team members that are in the process improvement team to begin with. So our first funnel is based on insight. Now what I'm going to do is zoom in just so that we can see how this actually plays out in a facilitated group environment. All right, with the voting rules established and with the funnel created, I then have my team members come up to the board and place their check on stakeholders that they feel, if we went out and interviewed in a voice of customer interview, would give us great insight. So from that, here's what typically happens. There'll be some stakeholders that I call rock stars. These are stakeholders that everybody thinks is important to go out and interview. It's going to provide great insight, far more insight than any of the individual team members have in the process improvement project. There'll be a few stakeholders that don't get unanimous votes, but get a couple of votes. They work in a unique area. They experience unique type of customer requests. They have unusual past experiences that may not be a reflection of what the team already has knowledge about. They get a couple of votes. There'll be a lot of stakeholders, though, on this list that when you look at them, the team member will go, well, that stakeholder could provide some insight. I don't know that they'd give me any more insight than my other team members have. I don't know that they'd give any more insight than some of these other stakeholders that have already been identified, and they are self-selected away. It's not saying that the stakeholder isn't affected by the process, but as it relates to insight, there are other more importance. And so many of the stakeholders are then self-selected away. And what I find, and this isn't based on any sort of deep research, but more on my practical experiences. When we do this stakeholder funneling based on insight, I can expect to see about 50% of the list reduced based on funneling on insight. Once we step back, we see that we've reduced the list by a significant number and we've gotten to our final vetted value. And if you remember in our example, we wanted to get to 10 or less. We'll stop right there. And let's just say that we did get the list reduced by 50%. 50% of 23, we're looking at 11 or 12 in this hypothetical example. And that's good, but now that's still too many. So we'll then move on to the next step of this funneling exercise. Let me zoom out to explain. So if after the first round of funneling based on insight has created a new reduced list, but that list is still bigger than what our final list is that we're shooting for, we may add an additional funnel. The second funnel that I typically use is to have the team funnel based on influence. And by influence, I mean these new, not newer, but this refined list of stakeholders that already provide great insight. From these very insightful stakeholders, which of them also have great influence on the success of the project? They have organizational influence. They have access to additional resources that the team might need. They can win the hearts and minds of the folks that are going to have to take ownership of the future state solution. We funnel that refined list based on influence. Typically, that list then is reduced by an additional 50%. And if we say started with 12 in our refined list and we reduce it down to 6, bingo, we're set. We've gotten to our 10 or less value that we're looking for, and we stop the exercise. If you're dealing with extremely large lists and after 2 rounds of funneling, you're still not at your target final vetted value, I might do a third set of funneling, and that third round, the criteria that I use would be based on my team's decision, where I would ask the team, we've reduced the list based on insight or knowledge that they're going to provide us about what's needed in current state or future state. We've funneled based also on influence and what other variable are we missing. And I have the team identify a third characteristic that's important, and almost always we'll end up with our reaching our final vetted values. I call it a funneling approach, an iterative approach at taking a large list and shrinking it down to a smaller final list. The same thing can be done for critical to quality variable reduction. Let me explain what I mean by that. So in this example, I've got 30 different critical to quality variable statements where we have the whole team take a look at the big list. This case, I've got 30 critical to quality variables that I lay out on a board. And in my first round, I could funnel that list based on, say, for instance, ease. How difficult will it be to grab that measurable variable? I could also funnel on impact. How great of an impact does it have on overall performance? I could funnel the variable based upon how much we think the measurement of this variable will help improve buy-in for future state solutions and increase user acceptance to the eventual future state outcomes that we're looking for. All different types of funneling attributes that we could use to reduce a large critical to quality list. A funneling approach is a real easy way to start with many and get to few.